What if your last name is still carrying the echo of a battle fought almost 1,000 years ago? What if the word at the end of your full name can hint at whether your family came from the conquerors or the conquered? If this kind of hidden history pulls you in, like this video, subscribe for more deep stories, and share it with one person whose last name now feels a lot more mysterious. Because in England, a surname is not always just a label. Sometimes it is a scar. Sometimes it is a trophy. Sometimes it is a quiet clue that survived kings, wars, marriages, migrations, and whole centuries of change. And to understand why, we have to go back to one date that changed England forever. 1066. Most people know the headline. William of Normandy crossed the Channel. Harold Godwinson tried to stop him. The two sides met at Hastings. Harold died. William won. But the part many people miss is what happened after the fighting ended. The conquest did not stop at the battlefield. It moved into land, power, language, law, and daily life. England was not just defeated, it was reorganized. Norman lords were rewarded with land. Old English nobles were pushed aside. French became the language of the court, the law, and the ruling class. English stayed alive among ordinary people, but now it lived under a new elite. And over time, that split left fingerprints in family names. That is why some English surnames feel plain, practical, and rooted in work. They grew out of Old English village life. Others sound polished, noble, or slightly foreign. Many of those came in with Norman families, or with the French influence that followed them. Now, one warning before we go further. A surname is a clue, not a perfect DNA test. Families moved. Names changed spelling. Some people took new names. Some names crossed from France into England, then to Ireland, then to Scotland, then to America. So this is not a courtroom verdict. It is a powerful historical pattern. And once you see the pattern, it becomes hard to unsee. If your name comes from a trade, a tool, a village role, or a plain Old English word, there is a good chance it leans Anglo-Saxon. If it comes from a place in Normandy, from a French nickname, or from the old Norman habit of naming people by lineage and lordship, it may point to Norman roots. Let's start with one of the biggest names in the English-speaking world, Smith. If your last name is Smith, your family name almost certainly sits on the Anglo-Saxon side of the story. Smith comes from the Old English word for striking or working metal. A smith was the blacksmith, the maker of tools, nails, blades, and horseshoes. In medieval life, that was not a fancy role, it was an essential one. No village worked without a smith. No farm lasted long without one. No soldiers marched far without ironwork behind them. That matters because Smith feels ordinary now. But ordinary names often preserve the deepest history. Smith was tied to labor, skill, and usefulness. It belonged to the people who made society function from the ground up. It is the kind of surname that tells you your family history was built with hands. Now look at Percy. Percy sits on the other side. It is a Norman name, taken from a place in Normandy. That pattern matters. A lot of Norman names came from locations. The family was not named for a trade. It was named for where it held identity and status. Percy became one of the great aristocratic names in England. For centuries, the Percy family sat close to power, especially in the north. Castles, titles, influence, war, rebellion, royal politics. It is the kind of surname that entered England wearing armor, so right away you can feel the difference. Smith tells you what a man did. Percy tells you where a ruling family came from. That split appears again and again. Take Baker. Baker is Anglo-Saxon. It comes from the person who made bread, probably one of the most important people in any pre-modern settlement. Bread was survival. A baker was not a side character in village life. A baker helped keep the whole place alive. The name is direct, practical, and deeply English. Now compare that with Neville. Neville comes from the Norman French world. It traces back to a place name, often explained as New Town, but there was nothing small about the family's role in England. The Nevilles became powerful magnates, especially in the late Middle Ages. One Neville was so influential that history remembers him as the kingmaker. That alone tells you what kind of surname this was. Not bread, not tools, not cloth. Power. And this is where the story gets interesting because surnames are not just labels from the past. They can preserve the social shape of the past. After the conquest, Norman families controlled huge amounts of land. That matters more than most people realize. Land meant rent, land meant food, land meant legal authority. Land meant that one family could pass advantage to the next generation, and then to the next, and then to the next. A battlefield victory turned into an inheritance machine. Meanwhile, many Old English families stayed in the world of work. They still mattered. They still built, baked, forged, carried, guarded, and farmed. But they did it from lower levels of the social ladder. That is one reason historians and social scientists have been so fascinated by surnames. In broad patterns, names can preserve the memory of who started high and who started lower. Now consider Fletcher. At first, Fletcher sounds English, and in the social sense, it usually lands with the Anglo-Saxon working world. A Fletcher made arrows. Think about how important that was. In medieval war, arrows could decide battles. An army was only as deadly as the craftspeople behind it. The men on the front line get remembered. The hands that equipped them usually do not, but the surname remembers. Then there is Mortimer. Mortimer is Norman. It came from a place in Normandy and became a name tied to marcher lords, the families who controlled dangerous border regions and gathered serious military power. Mortimer is one of those names that sounds old, dark, and heavy because it is. It carries the mood of fortresses and political danger. When you hear Mortimer, you're not hearing a village trade. You're hearing the aftertaste of conquest. Now, let's make this personal. Maybe your last name is Cooper. That is another strong Anglo-Saxon leaning name tied to barrel making. And that may sound boring until you remember what barrels meant. Barrels stored beer, grain, fish, wine, water, salt, oil, and cargo. In a world before plastic, refrigeration, and modern packaging, the Cooper was part of the system that kept trade alive. Again, a work name, a practical name, a name from the engine room of society. But if your name is Darcy, you are in a very different atmosphere. Darcy is Norman. It came from a place in northern France and became attached to landed families. Even now, the name sounds elegant, almost too elegant. That is not an accident. The social aura around some surnames survives long after people forget why it was there in the first place. A name like Darcy still feels as if it belongs in a manor house, because for centuries it often did. And then there are names that trick people. Russell is one of them. A lot of people assume Russell must be plain English. It sounds familiar, it sounds settled. But Russell is Norman in origin, linked to Old French and often explained as a nickname for someone with red hair. That is another Norman pattern worth noticing. Not every Norman surname came from a place. Some came from French descriptive nicknames that later became family names. So if your surname has a slightly French texture hiding inside an English sound, that can be a clue. Now let's stop for a second and test the pattern. Anglo-Saxon leaning names often come from work, status, or clear village function. Smith, Baker, Cooper, Ward, Webb, Wright, Thatcher, Freeman. Norman leaning names often come from French, from places, from lineages, or from families that arrived in the orbit of land and power. Percy, Neville, Darcy, Russell, Mortimer, Montgomery, Warren, Fitzgerald, and Fitzgerald may be the one that shocks people most. If you grew up thinking Fitzgerald was deeply, purely Irish, you are not alone. But the structure of the name tells a different story. Fitz comes from the Norman French way of saying son of. In other words, Fitzgerald originally means son of Gerald through a Norman naming style. Later, that family became deeply rooted in Ireland, so the name became part of Irish identity. But the doorway it used to enter history was Norman, not Gaelic. That kind of twist is exactly why this topic is so addictive. Names you thought were native can turn out to be imports. Names that sound elite can come from a hair color. Names that sound humble can hide centuries of endurance. And some names reveal not just rank, but freedom. Freeman is a powerful example. Freeman is Anglo-Saxon in spirit and language. It points to a person who was legally free, not bonded. That meant something in a world obsessed with status and obligation. A name like Freeman carries an idea inside it. It says this person stood in society with recognized liberty. Even the name itself feels like a declaration. Bond, on the other hand, has a much rougher history than most people imagine. Today, Bond sounds sleek because popular culture made it sleek. But in older English usage, bond was tied to land, labor, and dependence. It connected to the world of farming and status under pressure. That gives the name a strange tension. One of the coolest names in modern fiction may have roots in one of the least glamorous corners of social history. If you're still watching, drop a comment with your last name, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive, and share this with a friend before they find out their purely English surname may not be what they think. Now let's go deeper, because the biggest clue is not just which names sound English and which sound French. The biggest clue is what kind of world the name comes from. Take Ward. Ward is Anglo-Saxon. It comes from guarding, watching, keeping safe. You can almost see the role. The person at the gate, the person on the wall, the person awake while others slept. That is Old English society in a single word. Functional, direct, no decoration. Web is similar, and it may be even more interesting than most people realize. Web comes from weaving. Cloth was not a luxury in medieval life. It was daily necessity and big business. Wool and textiles helped drive the English economy. A weaving name tells you your ancestors may have been tied to one of the most important crafts in the country. Then there's Wright. Wright comes from making, crafting, building. It survives in names like wheelwright and cartwright, but Wright on its own still carries the old idea of a maker. This is exactly what Anglo-Saxon surnames do so often. They tie identity to useful action. Thatcher does the same thing. It points to roof making with straw or reed, the kind of trade that sounds simple until you remember that nearly every home needed it. A village without a Thatcher was a village waiting to leak. These names are not weak because they come from labor. They are strong because they come from labor. They tell you that before crowns and castles, somebody had to keep the world standing. Now step back into the Norman stream. Montgomery is a classic example. It comes from a place name in Normandy and entered British history through a family tied to command, land, and expansion. The sound of the name alone feels different from Smith or Ward. It has weight. It travels through the mouth differently. That is not your imagination. Norman names often kept traces of a French-speaking ruling class, even after generations of English life. Warren is another one. The word links back to a game preserve or enclosed hunting ground in the French world. That matters because it hints at ownership, privilege, and managed land. Even the meaning behind the name reflects a society of lords and estates rather than village trades. Grant is a great trap name. Many people hear Grant and think Scotland first. And yes, the name became very Scottish in history, but its deeper origin is Norman French, linked to a word meaning large or tall. That is one of the reasons surname history gets so messy and so fascinating. A name can arrive through Norman French, settle in Scotland, become part of Scottish identity, cross the Atlantic, and then get remembered as Scottish while its older French layer disappears from memory. The same thing happens with Baskerville. To modern ears, Baskerville sounds dramatic, literary, maybe even spooky. But underneath that atmosphere is a Norman family name, linked to a place in Normandy. It survived in England long enough to feel native, but the roots lie across the Channel. And then there's the little word that gives away a whole class system. Fitz. Any surname beginning with Fitz should make you stop and look twice. Fitzgerald, Fitzpatrick, Fitzwilliam, Fitzsimmons. That opening piece is one of the clearest Norman fingerprints. It means son of, but not in an Anglo-Saxon way. It comes through Norman French naming practice. That does not mean every person with Fitz in the name comes from the same line or the same rank, but it does mean the name carries a Norman linguistic stamp. So if your family name starts with Fitz, chances are the story behind it is more layered than it looks. Now here is the emotional part most people never think about. For the families on the Anglo-Saxon side, survival itself was an achievement. It is easy to tell this whole story as if one side was glamorous and the other side was ordinary. But ordinary is what kept civilization alive. The baker fed people, the smith equipped them, the cooper stored their goods, the ward guarded them, the web clothed them, the wright built what they used. Those names survive because those people mattered every single day. And survival after conquest is its own kind of victory. Because when a new ruling class arrives, one of the first things it often does is try to define what counts as high. It puts prestige on one language, one accent, one culture, one set of names. But the old names do not vanish. They stay in villages. They stay in records. They stay in churchyards. They cross oceans. They outlive palaces. That is why a name like Smith can be so powerful. It may not sound noble, it sounds durable. And durability is history's most underrated form of power. Let's talk about how these patterns lasted for so long. People often imagine history as a clean reset. A battle ends, a king dies, and then life simply moves on. But conquest does not vanish when the arrows stop flying. It gets baked into institutions. After 1066, Norman control shaped who owned the land, who held castles, who advised kings, who ran courts, and who passed wealth through inheritance. That does not mean every Norman name stayed rich forever. Of course not. Families failed, fortunes collapsed, branches died out. Some people with grand names lost everything. But when a group starts with a head start in land and privilege, echoes can last for centuries. And that is what later researchers found so striking. Broad surname patterns sometimes kept reflecting older social divisions long after people had forgotten the origin. Even hundreds of years later, names linked to elite medieval lines could still show up more often in places, connected to education, status, and influence. Not because a name is magic, because institutions have memory. Families inherit more than money. They inherit habits, expectations, networks, confidence, stories, and access. Sometimes they inherit the belief that they belong in certain rooms. Sometimes they inherit the opposite belief. That is how history can hide inside normal life. And names are one of the easiest containers for that memory. Now let's look at a few more names that people get wrong. Howard is often treated as English, and it is certainly one of the great names in English history. But its deeper origin is debated and layered. That is a reminder that not every surname fits neatly into one box, but some fit very clearly. Freeman feels Anglo-Saxon. Montgomery feels Norman. Webb feels Anglo-Saxon. Russell feels English, but is Norman. Thatcher feels Anglo-Saxon. Darcy feels Norman. Smith is Anglo-Saxon. Fitzgerald is Norman by structure, even if later history wrapped it in Irish identity. And Percy may be one of the clearest Norman names of all. There is another clue hiding in sound. Many Anglo-Saxon surnames are blunt, short, and rooted in concrete things. Smith, Webb, Ward, Bond, Wright. Many Norman surnames feel more shaped by place, by family identity, or by French rhythm. Neville, Percy, Warren, Russell, Montgomery, Mortimer. That does not make one kind better. It makes them different. And maybe the most important lesson here is this. A surname is not a medal for being superior. If your name is Norman in origin, that does not mean your life was destined to be easier. If your name is Anglo-Saxon in origin, that does not mean your ancestors were insignificant. In fact, some of the most resilient and culturally lasting names come from the Anglo-Saxon side. The name Smith conquered the English-speaking world in sheer numbers. The name Wright became linked to invention. The name Thatcher reached the top of British politics. The name Webb shaped intellectual life. The name Freeman still carries one of the strongest human words in any language, free. On the Norman side, the names often preserve the architecture of power. Percy preserves lordship. Neville preserves political ambition. Mortimer preserves military danger. Darcy preserves aristocratic polish. Montgomery preserves command. Fitzgerald preserves the Norman habit of naming sons through paternal lineage. These are not just names. They are different doors into the same national past. Now imagine England after the conquest. In the great houses, French speech, legal power, and royal favor. In the towns and villages, English speech, practical labor, daily survival, and the slow work of continuity. For a long time, those worlds lived side by side. One ruled, one endured, and their names stayed behind. That is why your last name can sometimes feel like a compressed social history of medieval England. It may tell you your people were tied to iron, bread, arrows, roofs, wheels, cloth, and watch duty. Or it may tell you they came in with new lords, new place names, new claims to land, and a new language of authority. Either way, your surname is carrying memory. The strange thing is that most of us never notice. We say our names so often that they turn invisible. But once you understand what you are hearing, the invisible is loud. Smith no longer sounds plain. It sounds foundational. Percy no longer sounds just elegant. It sounds imported. Russell no longer sounds simply modern. It sounds like French worn smooth by centuries. Bond no longer sounds only stylish. It sounds like social history with a sharp suit pulled over it. And Fitzgerald stops being just Irish-American nostalgia and starts looking like a Norman thread in a national story. If this is changing the way you hear your own last name, press like, subscribe for the next story, and share this with someone who thinks family history begins with a grandparent. Sometimes it begins with a battlefield. Now let's end with the question that matters most. What does your name really reveal? Not everything. It cannot tell you your whole bloodline. It cannot tell you what every ancestor believed, suffered, built, or dreamed. It cannot tell you whether one branch married into another, or whether a spelling shift hid a deeper origin. It cannot replace real genealogical research. But it can tell you the stream of history your family name flowed through. Was it shaped in the Old English world of work, village life, and stubborn continuity? Or was it shaped in the Norman world of land, lineage, French influence, and inherited rank? That difference matters because the Norman Conquest was not just one war. It was a rearrangement of status. It changed who owned England. It changed what language sounded prestigious. It changed which families entered the record with power, and which families stayed in it through endurance. And almost 1,000 years later, you may still be speaking one small piece of that story every time you introduce yourself. That is what makes surnames so haunting. They are everyday words carrying dead centuries. They are tiny museums with no walls. They are family history reduced to a sound. So if your name is Smith, Baker, Cooper, Fletcher, Ward, Webb, Wright, Thatcher, Bond, or Freeman, there is a strong chance your surname leans toward the Anglo-Saxon world, the world that was already in England. If your name is Percy, Neville, Mortimer, Darcy, Russell, Montgomery, Warren, Grant, Baskerville, or Fitzgerald, there is a strong chance your surname carries Norman influence, whether directly from England or through later branches. And if your surname is something in between, or one scholars still argue about, that may be the most interesting result. Because history is rarely pure. It mixes, it blends, it disguises itself, it leaves clues, then hides them under time. But those clues are still there. They hide in tax rolls, church records, manor lists, and court papers. They hide in gravestones worn down by rain. They hide in spelling shifts, too. A name may have changed shape 5 times and still be carrying the same old root underneath. That is why surname history feels almost supernatural at first. You think you hold a modern identity card, but you are really holding a medieval echo that kept adapting just enough to survive. And maybe that is the biggest surprise in this whole story. A name can survive when castles fall. A name can survive when borders move. A name can survive when families cross oceans and forget where they started. A name can survive long enough to become ordinary. And then one day, someone looks closely and realizes the truth. So the next time you hear an English surname, do not hear only a person. Hear a blacksmith at his fire, hear a baker before dawn, hear a watchman in the dark, hear a weaver at the loom, hear a lord crossing the channel, hear a clerk writing down a new landowner, hear Old English and Norman French colliding and mixing. Because your last name may be doing more than identifying you. It may be remembering for you. And if that memory reaches back to the winners, that is history speaking. If it reaches back to the people who stayed, worked, adapted, and endured, that is history speaking too. Either way, your surname is not small. It is a survivor. It is a signal. It is a message from medieval England that somehow made it all the way to you. And once you hear that message, you never hear the name the same way again.